Okay, so Daniel 7 is definitely one of is that first part really in Daniel. Well, maybe you could say this in chapter 2 a little bit, and in chapter 4 with the dreams. But this is the part that people probably sort of remember the most about Daniel, is that you start into chapter 7, and then chapter 8, and then chapter 9, and then all the way chapters 10 through 12. What feels like the whole second half of the book are all these really bizarre visions involving transmogrified creatures, metamorphosized, I guess, into semi-human features, and beasts, wild, untamed beasts that are devouring other beasts, and then a few little spotted visions of what appear to be something like God or divine-like figures or angelic figures coming into the story. You get angels, openly in the story. In chapter 9, the angel Gabriel makes an appearance in the book, the only place in the Old Testament where Gabriel appears, and he's in chapter 9. You get strange chronologies that are described, numbers of days, like 1,000 some odd days, and 490 weeks, and you just get all these different really wild compared to normal biblical narrative or letters, or the biographies like of Jesus and so on. It's just very different. It's called apocalyptic literature, and it's one of the things I think that sort of somewhat people tend to fizzle out around this time in Daniel. So they're really excited for the first bits, and then they get to this part and it's like, oh man, I mean, like, how am I going to make sense of this? And it doesn't feel like it's going to have much direct relevance to my life anyway, because it's just so much. They seem to be so far removed, and it's not even clear, are they visions of the remote future, or are they visions of things that were happening in the days of Daniel? There's debate even among the theologians who spend their lives studying these things. They can read Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, and they have all this deep insight or access, and yet they disagree on how to read some of these visions. So anyway, all that is just not. It was not actually intended to make this daunting for you. Although I think you might suspect that's what I was trying to do. It's just to put it in context of how people tend to react to these chapters and the attitudes they tend to bring. You start thinking of these end times novels and movies about the last days, and that which is not infrequently become almost an obsession for some Christians, that they just we've all known or are aware of some Christians that just seem to get way too excited about these end times visions, and so all that is just to say, if you try to step back a little bit and think about how we've been approaching the book, that the book is very carefully structured and very carefully organized. And the beginning of the second half of the book is actually not in chapter 7, but in chapter 6. Chapters 1 to 5 form an obvious, coherent whole, a story about the kings of Babylon and the first the sack of Jerusalem, and then eventually the collapse and sack of Babylon. So it's a nice coherent unit. And then chapter 6, which people, if you look at commentaries, I don't know if you do, but if you look at little Bible notes or commentaries, they tend to join chapter 6 with chapter 5 because it's more like narrative and not just visions of the end times. And so, but as we noticed, actually chapter 6 is the beginning of the second half of the book. It's the beginning of a series of stories that relate to writings, not to metals, as in the first half of the book. The key image is metals. In the second half of the book, the key image is writings that have to do with law, and writings that have to do with the truth, and various books. So That's a series, that's a continuity in the second half of the book. It's not a chronological continuity, but it's one of theme. And that is going to continue here in chapter 7. In fact, the very first words of chapter 7 say, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Let me change my color here. Daniel saw a dream and visions as he lay in his bed. And then he, what does it say he did? He wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. So here we have a writing, and it's the writing of the vision. And then look what happens when the Ancient of Days, here in verse 9, the Ancient of Days took his seat, and it says the court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The books were opened. And so we have another description of writings. And then this little horn that comes up and sits here, he seeks to change the times and the law. So writings of law and writings of truth. Okay, so that's, again, that was what we saw in chapter 6. We saw a discussion about the writing of the law that the Medes and the Persians issued under Darius, the writing that could not be changed because it was a law of the Medes and the Persians, and even the king was subject to that law. And we discussed a lot last couple of weeks about the laws that the different laws in the story of Daniel in the lions, in the den of lions. I never call it a lion's den, because a lion's den could be empty. It was a den of lions. It was it was full of lions. All right, so anyway, so that's just a reminder that chapter 6 and chapter 7 are connected, or closely connected. There's going to be an assessment, an evaluation of these Gentile kingdoms, and they're going to be related to or connected to various writings. All right, so let's read them briefly, and then we'll sit back and start to ask some questions or make some observations anyway. I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. And then as I looked, its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on the side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke it in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I considered the 10 horns, the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little horn, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. And his throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. Thousands and thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. I looked, and then behold, the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. and just a little bit more reading. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, with clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Mark that little expression in your mind. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. All right, so there we have it. This very long description, most interesting description of these four beasts coming up out of the sea and wreaking all sorts of destructive havoc on the various presenters. What I'm going to do here is stop presenting there and bring in a different window, because I want to refer to another part of the Bible, which is the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, the Gospel of Matthew, and the interrogation before the Sanhedrin. And the high priest, this is when Jesus is being, again, interrogated by the high priest. The high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, that is the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus answered, Jesus said to him, you have said so, which is in Greek, by the way, that's a literal translation. In Greek, it's a way of saying yes. But I tell you, and here's our key line, I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. From now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Okay? I hope you're not missing then the reference. You see the connection here to this line here? With the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. So in the trial of Jesus, when asked if he is the Messiah, Jesus says, yes, and he describes himself through an allusion to this part of Daniel. That is, he borrows from Daniel this statement, which clearly is being applied to himself. And though I didn't read the rest of the story, it's at that moment that the high priest tears his garments and then claims that Jesus is blaspheming, because he's identifying himself with this figure of the Son of Man coming from heaven, coming on the clouds of heaven. So all that is to say, even if you thought, oh, Daniel 7, this is that weird chapter, I just don't want to have to think about all these visions of beasts tearing other beasts to pieces, and the little horn with eyes talking, and 3 horns being plucked up. I mean, it's just all washing over me, and I don't really want to have to think about this. Well, guess what? You have one of the most pivotal scenes or moments in the entire account of the Gospels, is this moment when the Sanhedrin renders their verdict against Jesus. And what triggers that verdict of guilty is that he has quoted from Daniel 7 and applied it directly to himself. So you at that point, you have to just accept that the Lord himself, the Lord of heaven, was drawing our attention to this chapter if we wanted to understand who he truly was. If you really want to understand who Jesus actually is and what it means to be the Messiah and so on, here you have a passage that he has presented to you in order to help you think about him and reflect upon who he is and what he's up to, what his plan is, and so on. and not to mention his identity. So all that then gives us extra ground, you might say, to connect into this part of Daniel. All right, so I've given a defense of why we need to take our time and really understand this chapter. What I want to do now is briefly remind you of some connections in this book. Chapter 1, actually I'll do it by Roman numerals, I guess. Okay, so we got chapter 1, right? Is that clear enough? And you can all, is that big enough font? Can you see that fine? Yeah, looks like it. Okay, so we had chapter 1, and we had a question of whether Daniel would obey the law, right? That was the question. Only in this case, it was the law of Moses. In chapter 6, we had that same question, didn't we? Was Daniel going to obey the law of the Medes and Persians or obey the law of his God? In chapter 1, the question was whether he would obey the law of the Babylonians and their food rules, that the boys had to eat certain foods, or would he obey the law of his God? So that is the point is that's a parallel. And of course, the reason I'm mentioning these two chapters is because the first chapter is the beginning of the first half of the book, and the second chapter is the beginning of the second half of the book. Does that work? It just goes like that. Okay. And didn't want us to do that. All right. So now let's look at chapter 2. What was chapter 2 about? Well, it was the vision of this giant man. And the man was made of metals, different metals. And what did the different metals? There were 4 metals, actually: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. What did these 4 metals represent? Well, they represented 4 nations, 4 different nations. Okay. The nations were Babylon. Remember, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You are this head of gold. You, Babylon, are this head of gold." So they represented 4 nations. Okay. Now let's look here at chapter 7. What's the image of here? Well, we have terrifying beasts, animals, wild, feral animals. 4 of them. And what do they represent? Well, they're going to represent 4 nations, 4 different nations. And you can see right away some obvious differences here. In chapter 2, we had this giant, impressive statue that has been artificially constructed by the genius of some human architect. I mean, that's the image, right? It's the kind of image you could find around Babylon, because they had Michelangelos in Babylon, and Phidias's, who was a famous Greek architect, and they could build things like this giant statue out of composite metals, and it was very impressive as it shined in the sun. It was a very impressive image. It said a lot about what humans could accomplish as nations and governments. All right, well, over here, look at the contrast. These 4 beasts, well, where do these beasts come from? Were they built by human hands? Were they designed by some architect? Now, where do the beasts come from? They come in the vision. Where do they come from?
Heavens.
Well, the 4 beasts, I am not giving you the passage, so it's not very fair. I should put it up here. That's right, Diane. They come here out of the sea, right? They came up, I can't get my, there it is. Came up out of the sea, okay? So that's those beasts coming up out of the sea. And of course, as you would imagine, beasts are things that humans don't build. They come out of nature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that sea in just a second. But the point is that these aren't aren't constructed and designed by humans. These are things that work off of instinct. We have, you know, our dog, Sir Winston, is an Aussie door. He's Australian Shepherd and Labrador, and so he looks like a lab in his body shape, but all of his markings look like an Australian Shepherd. And he's a little funny to watch because his instincts are primarily Australian Shepherd. So he tries to herd everybody, and he has the way he carries his body, where he gets real low to the ground and crawls on the ground like Australian Shepherds do. But he's a lab, you know, like he looks like a lab. So why is he doing all that? Well, he's doing it out of pure instinct. We didn't train him to crawl around the yard on his belly when he's waiting to go chase a ball or something. You know, he's just got his own package of instincts. Okay, so these beasts are working more out of instinct, is what we're going to find out. All right, now before I move on from there, because we got lots to say about this comparison. Let's look at how am I going to do this? How do these beasts how do the nations get destroyed in chapter 2? You remember the dream with the giant image? How does it actually get destroyed? Anyone remember? You're right, it's a rock, but it's not from heaven. By the way, some of you may have answered, but your mute's on, so I wouldn't know. You can unmute and answer, or you can write it in. So it's a rock, but it's not from heaven. Anyone happen to remember? Well, the rock was cut out of a mountain. That's right. It was broken off from a mountain. And it was crude. It was cut out, it says, without human hands. It wasn't nicely cut, like you might cut a rock in order to add it to a building, like an architect would do. It was a rough image, crude, and it flew across the desert and it smashed the giant man to pieces. Okay, so it's a very rough stone that cuts. Whoa! Don't know why it went way down there. That cuts that image to pieces. There. So now tell me, what about as you went down? Again, we're still talking now about this giant man in chapter 2. As you went from the head of gold at the top, you know, and you went down to the different nations, what happened to each nation? Were they becoming weaker, or were they becoming stronger as you went down the image? Anyone remember that? Do you feel like you're getting a quiz in history class or something? Yes, there you go. They became stronger, right? Because the legs were made of iron. The midriff was of bronze, and then the chest of silver. So as you went forward through the nations, it became stronger. Megan's right, until you hit the toes, and in the toes you got this fatal weakness. And the fatal weakness, the clay mixed in with the iron, meant that the whole image itself was going to topple over, as somebody has already suggested, was basically going to topple over under its own weight before the rock cut out of the mountain ever comes and hits it. So however, even though it seems to be getting stronger, as you get to the toes, you realize that the final kingdom is so fatally weak, it's going to self-destruct. Okay. Now we just read the story of the vision of the beasts. Now, as we go through those beasts, they are getting stronger. When you get to the fourth beast, it's so strong that it's separate. It's considered separately from all the other beasts. In fact, if you didn't notice it, it's the only one that isn't likened to an animal. In other words, all the other ones are sort of grotesque combinations of different animals merged together, transmogrified. But in the case of the final beast, it doesn't say it's like anything. It says it's unlike anything that has come before it. So it's not recognized as a typical sort of beast in that sense. And of course, remember, it's representing a nation. So it will be a nation that is unlike any other nation that has gone before it. Now, does that beast have some fatal weakness? When you look at the feet of the fourth beast, does it have like clay in it? Or does it have thorns in its paws like Androcles' lion, that keeps it from being very effective at destruction? No. When you look at this beast's feet, what you're told is that if its mouth doesn't devour the heads of the other beasts, then and the bodies of the other beasts, then whatever is left of the carcass of the other nations, it tramples them, it stamps on them with its feet. In other words, the feet of the fourth beast are totally the opposite of the feet of that giant man, where there's these claws, and there's some of the greatest strength in that beast is in its legs and in its feet and in its toes, as it rips other beasts to shreds if it's not devouring them with its mouth. By the way, I just have to share this with you. As I came down the stairs this morning, our cat Daphne, who's an outdoor cat, she got her first chipmunk kill of the season. And so as I came down the stairs down here, I saw the top half of the chipmunk gone and the rest of it across the welcome mat. Hopefully no one will be visiting us this morning. But I felt like it was my own vision, my own nightmare that God had given me to make sure I emphasize how grotesque it is to see these beasts devouring other beasts. All right. Sorry, sorry I shared that. I'm sure nobody wanted to hear that, but anyway, in our house, it's pretty much a daily occurrence starting in the spring. So now we're gonna have to deal with this every day. And I think you know who cleans them up. It's not one of my girls. All right. So I hope you're seeing what I'm trying to do is show you that it's unmistakable that this part here in chapter 7, the vision in chapter 7, is responding to the vision in chapter 2. It's a kind of part 2 of a similar story. Okay. Now, how do these beasts get destroyed? Remember in chapter 2, this glorious, awesome, very carefully constructed human image was destroyed by something that was its opposite, a dumb, crudely cut stone that just smashed it to pieces. It was pure power that came and absolutely eviscerated and smashed to pieces the giant image of metal, so much so that it became like dust that the wind blew away. How do the 4 beasts get destroyed? in chapter 7. Well, the image comes of, yes, it is. Where does the fire come from, though? It is coming. Where does it come from? A river of fire. Yeah, it's like lava. Yeah, the Ancient of Days. And he, if I can move him over, this text box is not the easiest thing to deal with. So the Ancient of Days, and then after the Ancient of Days, there comes one who's called the Son of Man, right? The Son of Man. And how is the Ancient of Days described? Yes, he's white. He's got white hair, white garments. He's obviously very old. And how about the Son of Man? Why is this person called the Son of Man? What does it mean to describe a human as a son of man? Why not just say a man or a human being? What is this title, Son of Man, suggest? Does anyone know? It's, if you don't know, it's used by Jesus a lot. It's his preferred way of referring to himself. Yes, it is a title of Jesus, but what does it mean? Why is he called Son of Man? Um, the place where you might associate the term is at his baptism. But he's referred to in many other cases like that. But well, Son of Man, most people or most interpreters believe that it's a term which means he's the ideal man. He's the perfection of humanity. He's the Son of Man in that he's the ideal. He's what a human was always intended to be in his fullness, in his glory. He's what where Adam and Eve failed, he becomes the reality, the fulfillment of. Okay, so he's Son of Man. He's the perfection, and of course that goes well, doesn't it, with the idea of the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days is also describing a human type figure who has white hair. And why is his hair white? Not only because he's righteous, but because he's wise. And how does this Ancient of Days carry out his destruction, his judgment? What does he do to carry this out? Well, it says he opens up the books. He opens up the books. Now, why might that be important? Why the books? Well, you have to set all this in contrast. Remember in chapter 2, the stone was a deliberate contrast with that glorious, beautifully constructed image of a human being. The stone was just raw power smashing it to pieces, and it was crudely cut. It was the opposite. So here, have you ever seen a wild beast? Ever visited the zoo and discovered a lion with a children's book open? You're not going to see beasts reading books, right? The image of the Ancient of Days and of the Son of Man, and that ideal man, and the wisdom of the Ancient of Days, who is just, he is righteous with his white garments and so on, reading books. You get the contrast with the beasts? The beasts are untamed, amoral, wild animals operating purely off of instinct. Whereas the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man are opening books. They are just, and they are wise, and they are rational. And their judgment is not raw power destroying other power. The image isn't about like that stone in chapter 2, where it was all about raw power defeating the otherwise impressive human accomplishments in the four nations represented by the man. Here, it's the other side of the coin. It's these nations which have lost control and are accomplishing evil that is unimaginable if it were just one man. But as a group of men, they become like a wild beast and can destroy at levels that really are almost unimaginable. Think of World War II, 450,000 Americans dead. Americans alone, tens of millions, of course, across the world dead from World War II alone. 6 million just in the camps of Jews that were lost. And so how does God judge these wild, feral animals? Well, he justly and rationally opens the books and reads the evidence like a judge would do. He reads the evidence. He reads the full, complete record of their actions, and he holds them morally accountable. All right, so it should be obvious anyway that the image of how they're judged is the opposite of how these beasts themselves appear and seem to act. Okay, we'll come back to this. I just wanted to show you how chapter 6 answers to chapter 1, and how chapter 7 answers to chapter 2. And guess what's going to happen as you go forward? You're going to go to chapter 3, and it's going to answer to chapter 8, and so on. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of something interesting to do. If you're going to read chapter 8 and you think, oh, I'm kind of bored with reading Daniel, I'm just bored. Well, maybe you could read chapter 3 first, and then read chapter 8 and try and look for the relationships between those two chapters. Okay, all right, that was a fairly long introduction to how these all relate to one another, but I really wanted to lay them out so you began to see how some of the imagery is working. And notice that we haven't really attempted to try and decode all of this. We've only said in the most generic of ways that clearly the beasts represent nations. That's obvious when you read the chapter the very first time you read it. And it's also obvious that the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man represent divine figures. The Ancient of Days because he's ancient and he's seated on a throne and has white hair and white garments. And then the Son of Man because he comes on the clouds. Humans don't come on clouds when they come into the world. At least I wasn't brought on a cloud into the world. Some parents occasionally think their kids have been brought on clouds into the world, at least initially. Boris Johnson, his I think fiance had a baby this morning, had his baby. He just survived, coronavirus just a week or two ago. And anyway, they had a baby boy this morning, and he described it as unalloyed joy. I thought that was a great description, but still not coming on the clouds. This is a divine type figure if he's coming on the clouds. All right, anyway, we've only talked about it in the most generic of ways. We'll have to talk a little more specifically as we get into the details. Yeah, yes, that is right, Elizabeth. By the way, I don't know, have you all noticed the amount of articles in the news about people having dreams, having very vivid dreams? Have you all seen any of those articles? I've seen probably 5 or so. Yeah, okay, so you are. So it's very interesting because I read the first article probably a week or so ago. And I thought that's kind of funny because I guess I would say, yeah, I've had a couple of vivid dreams, but honestly, I dismissed it. And then this week I've seen 2 more articles about how people are collectively in this lockdown period having very heightened and vivid dreams. And I didn't quite know what the point of this was in the article. And I just kind of thought, I don't know. I'm not sure I buy that. Maybe it's just that people are having more time in the morning or something, and so they have a chance to think about their dreams. And last night I had by far the most terrifying dream. It may have been because I was reading Daniel 7 before I went to bed, but I had a terrifying dream of I was at the beach, and I saw some big waves come crashing in. Plus, there's supposed to be a storm or something today. So I saw some big waves coming, and all of a sudden, as they got within about 100 yards, it was clear that they were like 100-foot waves. And I looked behind me, and the beach went up a little bit. So I ran about 25 feet, and I thought, great, it's going up. And I got to the top, and I looked down. So I'm on the beach, but I'm looking away from the water, and the sand drops down about 50 feet. It's not all, like it slopes down. You can run down it, but it's more like a desert hill, and it goes way down into this like valley 50 feet deep and goes for about 200 yards and then starts to go up again. And I look back at the water and I'm like, if I go down into that, I'm toast. There's no way I can get out of it. And that was the end of my dream. I don't remember what happened next, but okay. Anyway, back to Daniel's vision. What I want you to notice here in this vision is that first of all, I want to pick out a number of things in the vision without attempting in any way to interpret how exactly it applies to nations and so on. Okay. In other words, I just want to read the dream on its own terms. So this is something that can help, I think, when we're reading the Bible, particularly with this apocalyptic type literature, is don't immediately try to decode everything. Just try to understand the dream on its own terms. In other words, try to enter into the vision and the obvious relationships between the various features of the dream before you press on to how it might be interpreted. And to be clear, the interpretation doesn't come anyway until the second half of the chapter. Daniel asks one of these people, it says here in verse 16, he asked the truth concerning all this. And so he told me. So good news, you get some interpretations of what this all means. But let's just try to let the vision itself sink in. And that'll easily take us to the end of our session. So the first thing to note is that it's the vision is a vision of the night. Okay, it's not just that Daniel had the vision in the night, but that the vision takes place in the darkness. Okay, and behold, in the darkness, 4 winds were stirring up the great sea. Now, I ask you, why does it matter that it's 4 winds? Why might it be important? And again, I'm going to caution you, do not try to over-interpret. Don't try to come up with some symbolism. At this point, we're trying to ignore all the symbolic aspects. We're only interested in the vision on its own terms. In other words, if you're talking about real winds, you know, winds can come from different perspectives, right? So if you're talking about real winds, what's the effect if you're on the beach and it's at night and you have 4 winds? What's the difference between 4 winds and 1 wind? Exactly. I think, Jocelyn, that's essentially right, and same with everybody else. It's so if you have 1 wind, right, then you're gonna say, oh, the wind is coming from the west, or the wind is coming from the south. And if you know anything about the ancient world, they had names for these winds. The western wind, the southwestern wind in particular, was called a zephyr. And if the zephyr was blowing, then you knew you were going to have warmer weather, because winds blowing from the southwest brought in warm air and milder temperatures. Okay, so the southwest, the zephyr tended to bring warmer winds. Okay, and so on. So they had names for them. But 1 wind allows you to predict the direction of the wind, right? Yeah, and if you have 4 winds, then obviously the winds are fighting against one another. 4 winds means they're coming from different directions, and they're all blasting at the same time. So the effect of that is chaos, right? You couldn't be James Spann. You would be out of a job if all the winds from the different, if the jet streams were, if there was winds blowing from all 4 directions, you couldn't predict exactly what was going to happen. So in this case, the scene is a scene of chaos. And keep it in mind that as the 4 winds blast the sea, that it creates waves, but not in obvious, predictable wave kind of form like you're used to, but it creates those very violent waves that crash sideways and have undercurrents that are working sideways laterally to the shore. So keep in mind, we have yet to see a beast. There's no animal yet. We're just talking about, what is it like if you were standing out in front of that ocean and it was violent winds crashing from different directions, and violent, powerful waves intersecting laterally and smashing into one another as if they're hitting rocks on the shore, but they're hitting one another and spewing out all that, you know, like out of the whale's hole, you know, out in the water. You've all been near the ocean and have been like on rocks or something when they're getting crashed on by waves. You've been next to that, and you feel the violence and you feel the chaos of that kind of a moment, particularly if it's at night. When I lived in Los Angeles, we would go down to a jetty often at night, a group of us, and we would go way out, you know, 200 feet out into the water on this jetty. And every once in a while, it was so gusty at night and the waves were so violent that it was like we wouldn't go the final 50 feet, you know, because it was just too dangerous. And you could just feel the instability of it and the chaotic danger at hand. So you see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to excuse me, it's not me. Do you see what God was doing for Daniel? Is presenting to him this vision, so you get a feel for what's coming. And what happens is, as Daniel is looking out on the water at the beach, is a massive beast begins to surface like Godzilla out of the water and to come onto the shore. Okay, now that would obviously terrify you. Right, rightfully so. Particularly since this first beast is a lion. right? So the first beast you see is a lion. Well, there's no question you're going to be destroyed by the lion. I think I can't remember if I told you or another group the time that I encountered a lion at Walmart. Did I tell you all? I didn't tell you. So I went up to a Walmart. I think I was in Tennessee at the time, living in Tennessee, and out in front of the Walmart was a pickup truck with a flatbed trailer behind it, and there was a cage with 2 lions in it. It wasn't there as like for an exhibition or anything. These were guys who were just stopping at Walmart on their way somewhere else, and there were 3 guys, I think, and one of them had gone into the Walmart to buy something. Okay, so maybe it was this exotic Joe or whatever, I don't know. And so I went to, yeah, exactly. That's what I was just saying. And so I went to the came up to the back of the flatbed trailer, and the 2 guys were standing outside the truck up by the door, and I was in the back behind the flatbed trailer back by the cage. And even, you know, they probably could have seen me, but it wasn't like real obvious I was there when I came up because I wanted to look at these lions. And you could get within about 2 feet of the lions, and and then you know, you'd have to reach all over the flatbed trailer to get to the cage itself, right? So this is not probably the way you're supposed to. I think this is not the way you're supposed to travel with lions. But anyway, they were so there were 2 of them, and they were both not full sized. They weren't like babies. They were, you know, they looked to me like, not that I can judge lion ages, but they looked like they were still maybe a year shy of being full grown, but they were still big enough and muscular enough that were it not for the cage, I would be dead. Like there was no doubt that they could destroy me in an instant. So I go up to the cage, and only one of them is at the back of the cage, and that lion is just sitting there staring at me, standing, like, not, you know, not standing, but sitting, but upright, and just staring at me. And you know, I don't know what to say to a lion, so I started talking to it like it's a kitten, and the trying to be nice to it, which it turns out was really, really dumb. And I've got my hands, you know, to myself, like I'm not reaching out because I'm only 3 feet away from this guy. And the other lion is toward the front. And in about 5 seconds, he looks back and sees me. And as soon as his eye caught my eye, I could tell he wasn't happy. And he didn't just walk back, he pranced like the 8 feet or whatever it was back to the edge of the cage, and he stood there and stared at me. And I tried to speak nice, and I probably got 2 or 3 words out of my mouth, and he roared like a lion roars. I mean, the full lift up your head roar at me, and I nearly wet my pants. I'd never been that close to death from an animal, and it was a terrible, terrible thing. These guys in the front of the truck immediately ran over and told me to get, you know, kind of started yelling at me that I was too close. And I mean, there was no way they could have got to me, but still, to be that close to a lion's roar was, you don't forget it. There was no doubt he was going to destroy me if there wasn't the cage there. So Daniel is on the beach and there's no cage. Okay, so the feeling of destructive, the mortal threat of the lion is obvious. But then what happens is this. It says that, sorry, it's even worse than that. He had eagle's wings. Like, if lions aren't fast enough, this lion had wings like an eagle, so you never could outrun him. There was zero chance anyway that you could outrun him. And this is what happens. As I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground. That is to say, it was made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. Now, why is that important in our vision? And this is the final thing, and then we'll close. It's important because the beast though it starts out like a wild beast and has eagle's wings and is ready to destroy you, it changes. It undergoes a change, a transformation, and it becomes humanized. It stands up like a human on its back feet, on its hind feet, and then it is given a mind so that it can think rationally like a human. It becomes humanized. Okay? Now, why is that important as far as what we've talked about today? Well, because as much as this beast becomes humanized, and we'll talk about what that all might mean later, but as much as it becomes like a human, it doesn't stop the second beast from coming up, which was like a bear. The second beast is going to devour the first beast. So even though the first beast slowly becomes like a human and acquires a mind and can think rationally and so on, that doesn't have the power to save it. It still gets destroyed by another beast. Okay? And guess what happens with the little horn? When you get this little horn at the end, we're told that it has eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking. It also becomes like a human and can do human things. It gets humanized. But that won't save the fourth beast either. So there's these little flashes of the beast becoming humanized, but they never quite, it's not like they build on one another and become more and more rational and more just. They take on human characteristics, but in the end, the human characteristics aren't enough to bring in an eternal kingdom. But then look what happens here. Again, I'll read it to you now for like the fifth time today. In verse 13, it says, "Behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man." And he isn't just a beast that needs to be humanized. He's the perfect, ideal man. And when he comes to the throne, then an eternal kingdom, an everlasting kingdom is given to him, which will not pass away, and his kingdom, unlike the beasts, shall not be destroyed. So in other words, in the vision itself, it will take a different kind of man to show up in order to introduce the eternal kingdom of God. No other nation will produce a human that is like this final human. So however much a nation gets humanized and ceases to be its wild, untamed self and makes progress morally and intellectually, no amount of progress in any of these nations is going to be sufficient to keep those nations from self-destructing or being destroyed by another nation. It will take one unique, separate human who comes not from the sea on earth, out of its chaos, but from heaven above. So I hope you see a little bit why Jesus, when he was standing in front of one of those nations and being judged, why he alluded to this image of the Son of Man coming to these nations in order to destroy them and deliver the earth. All right, we'll come back to that later, but hopefully you at least begin to see this is yet another story about the gospel, and another story that is telling us something about the man, Christ Jesus, and why he was so unique, and why it was necessary that he show up on earth. And we'll talk much, much more about all these details as we go forward. Just wanted to give you a sense for how you can work with the images without having to immediately go to decoding them, and try to get a sense for what it means internally, the vision, before you get on to who it might represent, and so on. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you so much again for your word, and thank you for these books, what Daniel wrote down of what he saw and heard, and how it is still so powerful and so meaningful for us today who live on the other side of where Daniel stood, relative to that Son of Man who came long after Daniel, but has now, we can say, come long ago relative to us. And we look forward to his second coming, when he will return and set all things right that have been put wrong on this planet. We look forward to that. Pray for our city, for our state, for our nation, and for the world, that this virus will be tamped down and your grace would reign, and we would begin to be able to open up our societies and minimize the deaths, and be with people who are suffering and families that have been permanently altered and damaged by all this. And we pray in Christ's name, amen. Good to see everyone. Hope you have a great week.
Thanks, Bill. Good to see everybody.
All right. See you next Wednesday.
Thank you, Bill.
All right.
Week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Happy birthday, Sandy. Thanks, Bill.
Oh, did Sandy come in? Did she ever come in?
Come in? Did she come?
I don't think so.
Oh, I thought I saw her come.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it's her birthday. She can do what she wants to. Isn't that the way?
Thanks.
All right. See y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.